Chapter 18 of the Caravaners. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Christine Rottger. The Caravaners by Elizabeth von Arnim. Chapter 18. My hearers will, I hope, appreciate the frankness with which I show them all my sides, good and bad. I do so with my eyes open, aware that some of you may possibly think less well of me for having been, for instance, such a prey to supernatural dread. Allow me, however, to point out that if you do, you are wrong. You suffer from a confusion of thought, and I will show you why. My wife, you will have noticed, had on the occasion described few or no fears. Did this prove courage? Certainly not. It merely proved the thicker spiritual skin of woman, quite without that finer sensibility that has made men able to produce works of genius, while women have been able only to produce a merely mechanical process, young. She felt nothing, apparently, but a bovine surprise. Clearly, if you have no imagination, neither can you have any fears. A dead man is not frightened. An almost dead man does not care much either. The less dead a man is, the more do possible combinations suggest themselves to him. It is imagination and sensibility, or the want of them, that removes you further or brings you nearer to the animals. Consequently, I trust I am being followed. When imagination and sensibility are busiest, as they were during those moments I lay waiting and listening in my berth, you reach the highest point of aloofness from the superiority to the brute creation. Your vitality is at its greatest. You are, in a word, if I may be permitted to coin an epigram, least dead. Therefore, my friends, it is plain that at that very moment when you possibly may have thought I was showing my weakest side, I was doing the exact opposite, and you will not have intelligently followed the argument, say at the end of it, as my poor little wife did, but how? I do not wish, however, to leave you longer under the impression that the deserted farmhouse was haunted. It may have been, of course, but it was not on that night of last August. What was happening was that a party from the parsonage, a holiday party of young and rather inclined to be noisy people, which had overflowed the bounds of the accommodation there, was utilized the long empty front room as an impromptu, I believe that is the expression, ballroom. The farm belonged to the pastor. Observe the fatness of these British ecclesiastics, and it was the practice of his family during the holidays to come down sometimes in the evening and dance in it. All this I found out after Edelgard had dressed and gone across to see for herself what the lights and stamping meant. She insisted on doing so in spite of my warnings, and came back after a long interval to tell me the above, her face flushed and her eyes bright, for she had seized the opportunity, regardless of what I might be feeling waiting alone, to dance too. You dance too? I exclaimed. Do come, Otto, it is such fun, said she. With whom did you dance, may I inquire? I asked, for the thought of the Baroness von Ottringel dancing with the first comer in a foreign farm was of course most disagreeable to me. Mr. Jellyby, said she. Do come. Jellyby? What is he doing there? Dancing, and so is everybody. They are all there. That's why their caravans were so quiet. Do come. And she ran out again, a childish, eager expression on her face, into the night. Edelgard, I called. But though she must have heard me, she did not come back. Relieved, puzzled, vexed, and curious together, I did get up and dress. And on lighting a candle and looking at my watch, I was astonished to find that it was only 9:15. For a moment I could not credit my eyes, and I shook the watch and held it to my ears. but it was going as steadily as usual, and all I could do was to reflect as I dressed on what may happen to you if you go to bed and to sleep at 7 o'clock, and how soundly I must have done it. But of course I was unusually weary and not feeling at all well. 2 hours' excellent sleep, however, had done wonders for me, so great are my recuperative powers, and I must say I could not help smiling as I crossed the yard and went up to the house at the remembrance of Menzies' glass of tea. He would not see much milk about me now, thought I, as I strode, giving my mustache ends a final upward push, and guided by the music into the room in which they were dancing. The dance came to an end as I entered, and a sudden hush seemed to fall upon the company. It was composed of boys and young girls attired in evening garments, next to which the clothes of the Caravaners, weather-beaten children of the road, looked odd and grimy indeed. The tender lady, it is true, had put on a white and cobwebby kind of blouse, which, together with her short walking skirt and the innocent droop of her fair hair about her little ears, made her look at the most 18, and Mrs. Menzies had tricked herself out in white too, producing indeed for our admiration a white skirt as well as a white blouse, and achieving it at the most by these efforts an air of no doubt spurious cleanliness. But the others were still all spattered and disfigured by the muddy accumulations of the past day. Though they stopped dancing as I came in, I had time to receive a photograph on my mind's eye of the various members of our party, of Jellyby, whose loose-collared and wispy-haired gyrating with poor Frau von Ektham, of Edelgard, flushed with childish enjoyment, in the grip of a boy who might well have been her own if I had married her a few years sooner, and if it were conceivable that I could ever have produced anything so undeveloped and half-grown, and of, if you please, Menzies in all his elderliness, dancing with an object the short voluminousness of whose clothing proclaimed a condition of unripeness even greater than that of the two fledglings, dancing, in a word, with a child. That he should dance at all was, you will agree, sufficiently unworthy, but at least if he must make himself publicly foolish, he might have done it with someone more suited to his years, someone of the age of the lady, for instance, singularly unlike one's idea of a ghost, standing at the upper end of the room playing the violin that had half an hour previously been so incomprehensible to me. On seeing me enter, he stopped dead, and his face resumed the familiar look of lowering gloom. The other couples followed his example, and the violin, after a brief hesitation, whined away into passivity. "Capital!" said I heartily to Menzies, who happened to have been in the act of dancing past the door I came in by. "Capital! Enjoy yourself, my friend. You are doing admirably well for what you told me is a weed. In the German ballroom you would, I assure you, create an immense sensation, for it is not the custom there for gentlemen over 30, which," I amended, bowing, "I may be entirely wrong in presuming that you are, for gentlemen over 30, but he interrupted me to remark with the intelligence that characterized him, after all, what ailed the man was, I believe, principally stupidity, that this was not a German ballroom. "Ah," said I, "you are right there, my friend. That, indeed, is what you English call a different pair of shoes. If it were, do you know where the gentleman over 30 would be?" He spoiled the neat answer I had already of "not there," by, instead of seeking information, observing with his customary boorishness, "Confound the gentleman over 30," and walking his long-stockinged partner away. "Otto," whispered my wife, hurrying up, "you must come and be introduced to the people who are kindly letting us dance here." "Not unless they are of decent birth," I said firmly. "Whether they are or not, you must come," said she. The lady who is playing is—" I know she is a ghost," said I, unable to forbear smiling at my own jest, and I think my hearers will agree that a man who can make fun of himself may certainly be said to be at least fairly equipped with a sense of humor. Edelgard stared. "She is the pastor's wife," she said. "It is her party. It is so kind of her to let us in. You must come and be introduced." "She is a ghost," I persisted, greatly diverted by the notion, for I felt a reaction of cheerfulness, and never was a lady more substantial than the one with the violin. "She is a ghost, and a highly unattractive specimen of the sect. Dear wife, only ghosts should be introduced to other ghosts. I am flesh and blood, and will therefore go instead and release the little Ekdom from the flesh and blood persistencies of Jellyby." "But Otto, you must come," said Edelgard, laying her hand on my arm as I prepared to move in the direction of the charming victim. "You can't be rude. She is your hostess." "She is my ghostess," said I, very divertingly, I thought, so divertingly that I was seized by a barely controllable desire to indulge in open mirth. Edelgard, however, with the blank incomprehension of the droll, so often to be observed in women, did not so much as smile. "Otto," said she, "you absolutely must." "Must, dear wife," said I, with returning gravity, "is a word no woman of tact ever lets her husband hear. I see no must why I, being who I am, should request an introduction to a Frau Pastor. I would not in Storchwerder, still less will I at Frog's Hole Farm." "But you are her guest." "I am not. I came." "But it is so nice of her to allow you to come." "It is not niceness. She is delighted at the honor." "But Otto, you simply can't." I was about to move off definitely to the corner where Frau von Ektham sat helpless in the talons of Jellyby, when who should enter the door just in front of which Edelgard was wrangling but the creature I had last parted from on unfriendly terms in the church a few hours before, attired this time from chin to boots in a long and narrow button-down black garment suggestive of that of the Pope's priest. With a gold cross dangling on his chest, his eye immediately caught mine, and the genial smile of the party-giver with which he had come in died away. Evidently he had been there earlier, for Edelgard, as though she were well acquainted with him, darted forward, where, alas, remained the dignity of the well-born, and very officiously introduced me to him. Me to him, observe. "Let me," said my wife, "introduce my husband, Baron Ottringel." And she did. It was, of course, the pastor who ought to have been introduced to me on such neutral ground as an impromptu ballroom, but Edelgard had, as the caravan tour lengthened, acquired the habit of using the presence of a third person in order to do as she chose, with no reference whatever to my known wishes. This is a habit specially annoying to a man of my disposition, peppery perhaps, but essentially bon enfant, who likes to get his cautions and reprimands over and done with and forgotten, rather than be forced to allow them to accumulate and brood over them indefinitely. Rendered helpless by my own good breeding, a quality which leads to many a discomfort in life, I was accordingly introduced for all the world as though I were the inferior, and could only show my sensibility of the fact by a conspicuous stiffening. "Otto thinks it is so very kind of you to let us come in," said Edelgard, all smiles, and with an augmentation of officiousness and defiance of me that was incredible. "I am glad you were able to," replied the pastor, looking at me, politeness in his voice and chill in his eye. It was plain the creature was still angry because, in church, I would not pray. "You are very good," said I, bowing with at least an equal chill. Otto wishes, continued the shameless Edelgard, reckless of the private hours with me ahead, to be introduced to Mrs. Raggett, supplied the pastor. And I would certainly have been dragged up then and there to the round red ghost at the top of the room, while Edelgard no doubt triumphed in the background, if it had not itself come to the rescue by striking up another tune on its fiddle. Presently, said the pastor, now become crystallized for me into Raggett. Presently, then with pleasure. And his glassy eye, fixed on mine, had little of pleasure in it. At this point, Edelgard danced away with Jellyby from under my very nose. I made an instinctive movement toward the slender figure alone in the corner, but even as I moved, a half-grown boy secured her and hurried her off among the dancers. Looking round, I saw no one else I could go and talk to. Even Mrs. Menzies was not available. There was nothing for it then, therefore, but unadulterated Raggett. It is nice, observed this person, watching the dancers. He had a hooky profile, as well as a glassy eye, to see young people enjoying themselves. I bowed, determined to keep within the limits of strict iciness, but as Jellyby and my wife whirled past, I could not forbear adding, especially when the young people are so mature that they are fully aware of the extent of their own enjoyment. Yes, said he, without, however, any real responsiveness. It is only, said I, when a woman is mature, and more than mature, that she begins to enjoy being young. Yes, said he, still with no real responsiveness. You may possibly, said I, nettled by this indifference, regard that as a paradox. No, said he. It is, however, said I more loudly, not one. No, said he. It is, on the contrary, said I still louder, a rather subtle but undeniable truth. Yes, said he, and then I perceived that he was not listening. I do not know what my hearers feel, but I fancy they feel with me, that when a gentleman of birth and position is amiable enough to talk to a person of neither, it is particularly galling to discover that that person is so unable to grasp the true aspect of the situation as to neglect even to follow the conversation. Good breeding, as I have before remarked, a great hinderer, prevents one's explaining who one is, and emphasizing who the other person is, and doing then and there a sum of subtraction between one's own value and his, and offering him the result for his closer inspection. So what is one to do? Stiffen and go dumb, I suppose. Good breeding allows no more. Alas, there are many and heavy drawbacks to being a gentleman. Raggett had evidently not been listening to a word I said, for after his last extracted yes, he suddenly turned the glassiness of his eye full upon me. I did not know, he said, when I saw you in church. Really, the breeding that could go back to the church, and what happened there was too bad for words. My impulse was to stop him by saying, "Shall we dance?" But I was too uncertain of the extent, nay, of the existence of his powers of seeing fun to venture. That you were not English, or I should not have asked. Sir, I interrupted, endeavoring to get him at all costs out of the church. Who, after all, is English? He looked surprised. Well, said he, I am. Why, you do not know. You cannot possibly be certain. Go back 1,000 years, and, as I lately read in an ingenious, but none the less probably right book, the whole of Europe was filled with your fathers and mothers, starting with your 2 parents and 4 grandparents, and going backward, multiplying as you go. The 16 great-grandparents are already almost unmanageable, and a century or two further back you find them irrepressibly overflowing your little island and spreading themselves across Europe as thickly and as adhesively as so much jam, until in days a trifle more remote not a person living of white skin but was your father, unless he was your mother. Take, I continued, as he showed signs of wanting to interrupt, take any example you choose. You will find the same inextricable confusion everywhere, and not only physically, spiritually. Take any example, anything at random. Take our late lamented Kaiser Friedrich, who married a daughter of your royal house. It is our custom to regard and even to call our Kaiser and Kaiserin the father and mother of the nation. The entire nation, therefore, is, in a spiritual sense, half English. So accordingly am I. So accordingly, to push the point a step further, you become their nephew, and therefore a quarter German, a spiritual German quarter, even as I am a spiritual English half. There is no end to the confusion. Have you observed, sir, that the moment one begins to think everything does become confused? Are you not dancing? Said he, fidgeting and looking about him. I think one is often angry with people because, having assumed on first acquaintance that they are on one's own level of intelligence, their speech and actions presently prove that they are not. This is unjust, but, like most unjust things, natural. I, however, as a reasonable man, do my best to fight against it. And on Raggett's asking this question for all response to the opportunity I gave him of embarking on an interesting discussion, I checked my natural annoyance by realizing that he was what Menzies-Leigh probably was, merely stupid. Stupidity, my hearers will agree, is of various kinds, and one kind is want of interest in what is interesting. Of course, this particular stupid was hopelessly ill-bred besides, for what can be more so than meeting a series of, to put them at their lowest, suggestive remarks by inquiring if one is not dancing? "My dear sir," I said, preserving my own manners at least, "in my country it is not the custom for married gentlemen over 30 to dance. Perhaps you were paying me the compliment, often, I must say, paid me before, of supposing I am not yet that age. But I assure you that I am. Nor do ladies continue to dance in our country once their early youth is past, and their outlines become, shall we say, bolder. Seats are then provided for them round the walls, and on them they remain in suitable passivity until the oasis afforded by the lancers is reached, when the elder gentlemen pour gallantly out of the room in which they play cards all the evening, and lead them through its intricacies with the ceremony that satisfies society's sense of the becoming. In this country, on the contrary—" "Really," he interrupted, his habit of fidgeting more pronounced than ever, "you talk English with such a flow and volume that after all you very well might have joined." I now saw that the man was a fanatic, a type of unbalanced person I have always particularly disliked. Good breeding is little, if at all, appreciated by fanatics, and I might have been excused if at this point I had flung mine to the winds. I did not do so, however, but merely interrupted him in my turn by informing him with cold courteousness that I was a Lutheran. "And Lutherans," I added, "do not pray, at least not audibly, and certainly never in duets. More," I continued, putting up my hand as he opened his mouth to speak, "more, I am a philosopher, and the prayers of a philosopher cannot be confined within the limits of any formula. formulas are for the undeveloped. You tie a child into its chair lest, untied, it shall fall disastrously to the floor. You tie the undeveloped adult to a creed lest, untied, he should fall goodness really knows where. The grown man, of full stature in mind as well as body, requires no tying. His whole life is his creed. Nothing cut and dried, nothing blatant, nothing gaudily apparent to the outside world, but a subtle saturation, a continual soaking. "Excuse me," said he, "one of those candles is guttering." And he hurried across the room with an expedition I would not have thought possible in any man so gray and glassy, to where in the windows the illuminating rows of candles had been placed. Nor did he come back, I am glad to say, for I found him terribly fatiguing, and I remained alone, leaning against the wall by the door. Down at the further end of the room danced my gentle friend, and also her sister, also all the other members of our party except Menzies Leigh, who, recalled to decency by my good-natured shafts, spent the rest of his time soberly either helping the pastor pinch off candle wicks or turning over the ghost's music for it. Desiring to watch Frau von Eckham more conveniently, for I assure you it was a pretty sight to see her grace, and how the same tune that made my wife whirl moved her to nothing more ruffling than an appearance of being wafted, and also in order to be at hand should Jellyby become too tactless, I went down to where our party seemed to be gathered in a knot, and took up my position near them against another portion of the wall. I had hardly done so before they seemed to have melted away to the upper end. As they did not come back, I presently strolled after them. They then appeared to melt back again to the bottom. It was very odd. It was almost like an optical illusion. When I went up, they went down. When I went down, they went up. I felt at last as one may feel who plays at seesaw, and began to doubt whether I were really on firm ground. On terra cotta, as I thought, called it to Edelgard when we alighted from the steamer at Queensborough, endeavoring to restore her spirits and make her laugh. Quite in vain, I may add, which inclined me to wonder, I remember, whether the illiteracy, which is one of the leading characteristics of people's wives, had made it impossible for her to understand even so simple a classical play on words as that. In the train, I realized that it was not illiteracy, but the crossing. And I will say for Edelgard that up to the time the English spirit of criticism got, like the devastating microbe, hold of her German womanliness, she had invariably laughed when I chose to jest. But gradually the profitless seesawing began to tire me. The dance ended, another began, and still my little white-bloused friend had not once been within reach. I made a determined effort to get to her in the pauses between the dances in order to offer to break the German rule on her behalf and give her one dance, for I fancy she was vexed that I did not, and also to help her out of the clutches of Jellyby. But I might as well have tried to dance with and help a moonbeam. She was here, she was there, she was everywhere except where I happened to be. Once I had almost achieved success when, just as I was sure of her, she ran up to the ghost, resting at that moment from its labors, and embarked in an apparently endless and absorbing discussion with it, deaf and blind to all beside. And as I had made up my mind that nothing would induce me to extend my ragged acquaintance by causing myself to be introduced to the psychical phenomenon bearing that name, I was forced to retreat. Moodily, though. My first hilarity was extinguished. Bon enfant though I am, I cannot go on being bon enfant forever. I must have, so to speak, the encouragement of a bottle at intervals, and I was thinking of taking Edelgard away and giving her, before the others returned to their caravans, a brief description of what maturity combined with calf-like enjoyment looks like to bystanders. When Mrs. Menzies lay, passing on the arm of a partner, caught sight of my face, let her partner go, and came up to me. "I suppose," she said, and she had at least the grace to hesitate, "it would be no good asking you to dance." I stared at her in undisguised astonishment. "Are you not dreadfully bored standing here alone?" she said, as I did not answer. "Won't you," again she had the grace to hesitate, "won't you dance?" Pointedly, and still staring amazed, I inquired of her with whom, for really I could hardly believe. "With me, if you will," said she, a rather lame attempt at a smile, and a distinctly anxious look in her eyes, showing that at least it was only a momentary aberration. Momentary or not, however, I am not the man to smile with feigned gratification when what is needed is rebuke, especially in the case of this lady who of all others needed one so often and so badly. "Why," I explained, not caring to conceal my opinion, "why, this is matriarchy." And turning on my heel, I made my way at once to my wife, stopped her whirlings, drew her away from her partner's arm, Jellyby's, by the way, made her take her husband's, and without a word led her out of the room. But as I passed the door, I saw the look of, I should think pretended, astonishment of Mrs. Menzies' face give way to the appearance of the dimple, to a sudden screwing together of the upper and lower eyelashes, and my friends will be able to form a notion of how complete was the havoc England had wrought in all she had been taught to understand and reverence in her youth, when I tell them that what she was manifestly trying not to do was to laugh. End of chapter 18. Chapter 19 of the Caravaners. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Christine Rottger. The Caravaners by Elizabeth von Arnim. Chapter 19. Essentially, as I have already pointed out, mon enfant, I seldom let a bad yesterday spoil a promising today, and when on peeping through my curtains next morning, I saw the sun had turned our forbidding camp of the night before into a bland, warm place across which birds darted singing. A cheery whistle formed itself on my lips, and I became aware of that inward satisfaction our neighbors, to whom we owe, I frankly acknowledge, much besides Alsace and Lorraine, have aptly named the joie de vivre. Left to myself, this joie would undoubtedly always continue uninterruptedly throughout the day. The greater then, say I, the responsibility of those who damp it. Indeed, the responsibility resting on the shoulders of the people who cross one's path during the day is far more tremendous than they, in the thickness of their skins, imagine. I will not, however, at present go into that. Having gradually, in the course of writing this, become aware that what I shall probably do next will be to collect and embody all my more metaphysical side into a volume to itself, with plenty of room in it, and will here then merely ask my hearers to behold me whistling in my caravan on that bright August morning, whistling and ready, as every sound man should be, to leave the annoyances of yesterday beneath their own dust, and begin the new day in the spirit of, who knows, but before nightfall I shall have conquered the whole world. My mother, a remarkable woman, used to tell me it was a good plan to start like that. And indeed, I believe the results by nightfall would be surprisingly encouraging if only other people would leave one alone. For as they meet you, each one by his behavior takes away a further portion of that which in the morning is so undimmed. Why, sometimes just Edelgard at breakfast has by herself torn off the whole stock of it at once, and generally by dinner there is but little left. It is true that occasionally after dinner a fresh wave of it sets in, but sleep absorbs that before it has had time. As the colloquialists would say, so much as to turn round. My hearers, then, without my going further into this, must conceive me whistling and full of French joie in the subdued sunlight of the Elsa's curtained interior on that bright summer morning at Frog's Hole Farm. The floor sloped, for during the night the Elsa's left hind wheel had sunk into an uncobbled portion of the yard, where the soft mud offered no resistance. But even the prospect of having to dig this out before we could start did not depress me. I thought I had noticed my head sinking lower and lower during my dreams, and after having, half asleep, endeavored to correct this impression by means of rolling up my day clothes and putting them beneath my pillow, and finding that it made no difference, I decided it must be a nightmare and let well alone. In the morning, on waking after Edelgard's departure, I realized what had happened, and if any of you ever caravan, you had better see when you go to bed that all 4 of your wheels are on that which I call at Queensborough terracotta. You will remember I explained why it was my wife was unable to be amused, or you will have some pretty work cut out for you next morning. Even this prospect, however, did not, as I say, depress me. Dumb objects like caravans have no such power, and as nobody not dumb had yet crossed my path, I was still, so to speak, untarnished. I had even made up my mind to forget the half-hour with Edelgard the previous night after the ball, and since a willingness to forget is the same thing as a willingness to forgive, I think you will all agree that I began that day very well. Descending to breakfast, I experienced a slight shock, the first breath of tarnish, on finding no one but Mrs. Menzies Leigh and the nondescripts there. Mrs. Menzies Leigh, however, though no doubt feeling privately awkward, managed to behave as though nothing had happened, hoped I had slept well, and brought my coffee. She did not talk as much as usual, but attended to my wants with an assiduousness that pointed to her being, after all, ashamed. I inquired of her, with the dignity that means determined distance, where the others were, and she said gone for a walk. She remarked on the beauty of the day, and I replied, "It is indeed." She then said, slightly sighing, that if only the weather had been like that from the first, the tour would have been so much more enjoyable. On which I observed, with reserved yet easy conversation, that the greater part still lay before us, and who knew but that from then on it was not going to be fine? At this she looked at me in silence, her head poised slightly on one side, seriously and pensively, as she had done among the Bodiam ruins, then opened her mouth as though to speak, but thinking better of it, got up instead and fetched me more food. At last, thought I, she was learning the right way to set about pleasing, and I could not prevent a feeling of gratification at the success of my method with her. There was an unusually good breakfast, too, with increasing this feeling. Eggs and bacon, a combined luxury not before seen on our table. The fledglings hung over the stove with heated cheeks, preparing relays of it under Mrs. Menzies Leigh's directions, who, while she directed, held the coffee-pot in her arms to keep it warm. She explained she did so for my second cup. I might, and indeed I would have suspected that she did so not to keep the coffee but her arms warm, if it had not been such a grilling day. Heat quivered in a blue haze over the hop holes of the adjacent field. The sunless farmhouse looked invitingly cool and shady now that the surrounding hilltops were one glare of light. To hold warm coffee in one's arms on such a morning could not possibly show anything but a meritorious desire to make amends. And as I am not a man to do what the scriptural call quench the smoking flax, and yet not a man to forgive too quickly recently audacious ladies, I dexterously mingled extreme politeness with an unshakable reserve. But I did not care to prolong what was practically a tete-a-tete one moment more than necessary, and could not but at last perceive in her persistent replenishings of my cup and plate the exactly contrary desire in the lady. So I got up with a courteous declining, "No, no, a reasonable man knows when to leave off," murmured something about seeing to things, bowed, and withdrew. Where I withdrew to was the hop field and a cigar. I lay down in the shade of these green promises of beer in a corner secure from observation, and reflected that if the others could waste time by taking supererogatory exercise, I might surely be allowed an interval of calm. And as there are no mosquitoes in England, at least none that I ever saw, it really was not unpleasant for once to contemplate nature from the ground. But I must confess I was slightly nettled by the way the rest of the party had gone off without waiting to see whether I would not like to go too. At first, busied by breakfast, I had not thought of this. Presently, in the hop field, it entered my mind, and though I would not have walked far with them, it would have been pleasant to let the rest go on ahead and remain myself in some cool corner talking to my gentle but lately so elusive friend. I must say also that I felt no little surprise that Edelgard should gad away in such a manner before our caravan had been tidied up, and after what I had said to her the last thing the night before. Did she then think, in her exuberant defiance, that I would turn to and make our beds for her? My cigar being finished, I lay a while thinking of these things, fanned by a gentle breeze. Country sounds at a distance, to make them agreeable, gradually soothed ear and brain. A cock crowed just far enough away. A lark sang muffled by space. The bells of an invisible church, Raggett's probably, began a deadened and melodious ringing. Well, I was not going. I smiled as I thought of Raggett and the eagle, forced to make the best of things by themselves. All round me was a hum and a warmth that was irresistible. I did not resist it. My head dropped, my limbs relaxed, and I fell into a doze. This doze was, as it turned out, extremely apropos, for by the time it was over and I had once more become conscious, the morning was well advanced, and the Caravaners had had ample time to get back from their walk and through their work. Sauntering in among them, I found everything ready for a start except the Elsa, which still with its left hind wheel sunk in the soil, was being doctored by Menzies Leigh Jellyby and old James. "Hello," said Jellyby, looking up in the midst of his heated pushing and pulling as I appeared. "Been enjoying yourself?" Menzies Leigh did not even look up, but continued his efforts with drops of moisture on his saturnine brow. "Well, here my experience as an artillery officer accustomed to getting gun carriages out of predicaments enabled me at once to assume authority, and drawing up a camp stool, I gave them directions as they worked. They did not, it is true, listen much, thinking as English people so invariably do that they knew better. But by not listening they merely added another half hour to their labor, and as it was fine and warm, and sitting superintending them much less arduous than marching, I had no real objection. I told Menzies late at this time, but he did not answer, so I told him again when we were on the road about the half hour he might have saved if he had worked on my plan. He seemed to be in a more than usual bad temper, for he only shrugged his shoulders and looked glum, and my hearers will agree that Mrs. Menzies Lade's John was not a possession for England to be specially proud of. Journeyed that day toward Canterbury, a town you, my friends, may or may not have heard of. That is an English town, I need not say, for if it were not, would we have been going there? And it is chiefly noted, I remember, for its archbishop. This gentleman, I was told by Jellyby on my questioning him, walks directly behind the king's eldest son, and in front of all the nobles in processions. He is a pastor, but how greatly glorified! He is the final expansion, the last word of that which in the bud was only a curate. Every English curate, like Bonaparte's soldiers are said to have done, carries in his handbag a mitre of an archbishop. I can only regard it as a blessing that our church has not got them, for I, for one, would find it difficult, with this possibility in view, ever to be really natural to a curate. As it is, I am perfectly natural. With absolute simplicity, I show ours his place and keep him to it. I am equally simple with our superintendents and general superintendents. The nearest approach our pure and frugal church goes to bishops and archbishops. Nothing is more glorified about them. They are just respectable elderly men, with God-fearing wives who prepare their dinner for them day by day. And Jellyby, said I, can as much be said for the wives of your archbishops. No, said he. Another point then, said I, with the jesting manner one uses to gild unpalatable truth, on which we Germans are ahead. Jellyby pushed his wisp of black hair back and mopped his forehead. From my position at my horse's head, I had called to him as he was walking quickly past me, for I perceived he had my poor gentle little friend in tow, and was once again inflicting his society on her. He could not, however, refuse to linger on my addressing him, and I took care to ask him so many questions about Canterbury and its ecclesiastical meaning that Frau von Ektham was able to have a little rest. A faint flush showed she understood and appreciated. No longer obliged to exert herself conversationally, as I had observed she was doing when they passed, she dropped into her usual calm and merely listened attentively to all I had to say. But we had hardly begun before Mrs. Menzies Lay, who was in front, happened to look round, and seeing us, immediately added her company to what was already more than company enough, and put a stop to anything approaching real conversation by herself holding forth. No one wanted to hear her, least of all myself, to whom she chiefly addressed her remarks. The others, indeed, were able to presently slip away, which they did to the rear of our column, I think, for I did not see them again, but I, forced to lead my horse, was helpless. I leave it to you, my friends, to decide what strictures should be passed on such persistency. I cannot help feeling that it was greatly to my credit that I managed to keep within bounds of politeness under such circumstances. One thing, however, is eternally sure. The more a lady pursues, the more a gentleman withdraws, and accordingly those ladies who throw feminine decorum to the winds only defeat their own ends. I said this, slightly veiled, to Mrs. Menzies Lay that morning, taking an opportunity her restless and leaping conversation offered to administer the little lesson. No veils, however, were thin enough for her to see through, and instead of becoming red and startled, she looked at me through her eyelashes with an air of pretended innocence and said, "But, Baron dear, what is feminine decorum?" As though feminine decorum or modesty or virtue were things that could be explained in any words decent enough to fit them for a gentleman to use to a lady. That was a tiring day. Canterbury is a tiring place. At least it would be if you let it. I did not, however, let it tire me. In such a hot place. It is a steaming town with the sun beating down on it, and full of buildings and antiquities one is told one must be longing to look at. After a day's march in the dust, it is not antiquities one longs for, and I watched with some contempt the same hypocritical attitude take possession of the party that had distinguished it at Bodiam. We arrived there about 4, and Menzies lay pitched on an exceedingly ugly camping ground on the slope just outside the city, with villa residences so near that their inhabitants could observe us, if they had telescopes, from their windows. It was a field from which the corn had been cut, and the hard straw remaining hurt one's weary feet, nor had it any advantages that I could see, though the others spoke of the view. This, if you please, consisted of the roofs of the houses in the town, and a cathedral rising from their midst in a network of scaffolding. I pointed this out to them as they stood staring, but Menzies was quite unshaken in his determination to stay just on that spot, in spite of there being a railway line running along the bottom of the field, and a station with all its noises within a stone's throw. I thought it was odd to have come to a town at all, for till then the party had been unanimous in its desire to avoid even villages. But on my remarking on this, they murmured something about the cathedral, as though the building below, or rather the mass of scaffolding, were enough to excuse the most inconsistent conduct. The heat of that shadeless stubble field was indescribable. It did not possess a tree. At the bottom was, as I have said, a railway. At the top, just above where we were, a market garden, a thing of vegetables, whose aim is to have as few shadows as possible. Languidly the party made preparations for settling down. Languidly, after a long delay, Menzies dragged out the stew-pot. In spite of the heat, I was as hungry as a man ought to be who, at 4 o'clock, has not yet dined, and as I watched the drooping Caravaners listlessly preparing the potatoes and cabbages and boiled bacon that I knew so very thoroughly, this having been our meal, except once or twice when we had chickens, or in extremity underdone sausages, since the beginning of the tour. A brilliant thought illuminated the gloom of my brain. Why not slip away unnoticed, and down in the town cause myself to be served in the dining-room of an hotel with freshly roasted meat and generous wine? Very cautiously I raised myself from the hard stubble. Casually I glanced at the view. With an air of preoccupation I went behind the Elsa, the first move toward freedom, as though to fetch some accessory of the meal from our larder. "Do you want anything, Otto?" asked my officious and tactless wife, trotting after me, a thing she never does when I do want anything. Naturally, I was a little snappish, but then if she had left me alone, would I have snapped? Wives are great forcers of faults upon a man, so I snapped, and she departed, chidden. Looking about me up at the sky and round the horizon, as though intent on thoughts of weather, I inconspicuously edged toward the market garden and the gate. With a man in the garden searching for slugs, I spent a moment or two conversing, and then a backward glance having assured me the Caravaners were still drooping in listless preparation round the stew-pot, I sauntered humming through the gate. Immediately I ran into Jellyby, who, a bucket of water in each hand, was panting along the road. "Hello, Baron," he gasped. "Enjoying yourself?" "I am going," I said, with much presence of mind combined with the seriousness that repudiates any idea of enjoyment, "to buy some matches. Ours are running short." "Oh," said he, plumping down his buckets and fumbling among the folds of his flappy clothes. "I can lend you some. Here you are." And he held out a box. "Jellyby," said I, "what is one box to a whole? Shall we call it household? My wife requires many matches. She is constantly striking them. It is her husband's duty to see that she has enough. Keep yours, and farewell." And walking at a pace that prohibited pursuit by a man with buckets, I left him. I have had so many dinners in dining rooms since the one at Canterbury, ordered repasts without grease, and that kept hot, that the wonder of it has lost in my memory much of its first brightness. You, my hearers, who dine as I do regularly and well, would hardly, if I could still describe, be able to enter into my feelings. I found a cool room in an inn with the pleasantly un-English name Fleur de Lis, and a sympathetic waiter who fell in at once with my views about fresh air and shut all the windows. I had a newspaper, and I sipped a cognac while the meal was preparing. I ordered everything on the list except bacon, chickens, and sausages. I would also not eat potatoes, and declined as a vegetable cabbage. I drank much wine, full-bodied and generous, but I refused after dinner to drink coffee. Filled and hollowed, once more in thorough tune with myself and life, and ready to take any further experiences the day might bring with unruffled geniality, I left toward dusk the temple that had thus blessed me, after debating within myself whether it would not be prudent, having regard to the future, in further lanes and fields to sup first, and regretfully realizing that I could not, and leisurely made my way across the street to that other temple, whose bells announced the inevitable service. My decision to peep cautiously in and see whether the parson were alone, before definitely committing myself to a pew, was unnecessary. First, because there were no pews but a mighty emptiness, and secondly, because along the dusk of this emptiness, groups of persons made their way to a vast flight of steps dividing the place into two, and leading up to a region into which they disappeared, of glimmering lights. Too clever now by far to go where there were lights, and praying might be demanded of me, I wandered on tiptoe among the gathering shadows at the other end. It grew quickly darker among the towering pillars and dim, painted windows. The bells left off, the organ began to rumble about, and a distant voice, with a family likeness to that of Raggett, sing-songed something long. It had no ups and downs, no breaks. It was a drawn-out thread of sound, thin and sweet like a trickle of liquid sugar. Then many voices took up the sing-song, broadened it out from a thread to a band. Then came the single trickle again, and so they went on alternately, while I, hidden among the pillars, listened very well pleased. When the organ began, and an endless singing and repeating of the same tune, I cautiously advanced nearer in search of something to sit on. To the right of the steps I found what I wanted, an empty space in itself as big as our biggest church in Storchwerder, but small in comparison to the rest, with immense windows full of the painted glass that becomes so confused and meaningless in the dusk, no lights, and here and there a chair or two. I sat down at the foot of a huge pillar in this dark and unobserved corner, while the organ above me and the singing voices filled the spaces on the roof with their slumber-inciting repetitions. Presently As a tired and comfortable man would do, I fell asleep, and was only awakened by the subdued murmur just round the edge of the pillar of two people talking. And I instantly, almost before my eyes opened, recognized that it was Frau von Ekthom and Jellyby. They were apparently sitting in some chairs I had noticed as I came round to the greater obscurity of mine. They were so close that it was practically into my ear that they spoke. The singing was finished, and I fancy the congregation had dispersed, for the organ was playing softly, and the glimmer of lights had gone out. My ears are as quick as any man's, and I was greatly amused at the situation. Now, thought I shall hear what sort of stuff Jellyby inflicts on patient and inexperienced ladies. It also occurred to me that it would be interesting to hear how she talked to him, and so discover whether the libel were true that except in my presence she chatted and was jocular. Jocular? Can anything be less what one wishes in the woman one admires? Of course she was not, and Mrs. Menzies-Leigh was only, very naturally, jealous. I therefore sat quite still, and became extremely alert and wide awake. They were certainly not laughing. That, however, may have been the cathedral, not that men of Jellyby's stamp have even a rudimentary sense of reverence and decency. But anyhow, part of the libel was disposed of, for the gentle lady was serious. She was, it is true, a good deal more fluent than I knew her, but she seemed moved by some strong emotion which no doubt accounted for that. What I could not account for was her displaying emotion to a person like Jellyby. The first thing, for instance, that I heard her say was, "It is all my fault," and her voice vibrated with penitence. "Oh, but it wasn't, you know," said Jellyby. "Yes, it was. And I feel I ought to take a double share of the burden, and instead I don't take any." "Burden? What burden could the tender lady possibly have to bear that would not gladly be borne for her by many a masculine shoulder, including mine?" I was about to put my head round the pillar's edge to assure her of this when she began to speak again. "I did try at first," she said, "but I simply can't. So I shifted on to Di." Di, my friends, is Mrs. Menzies-Leigh, christened with the prophetic paganism Diana. An extremely sensible thing to do, thought I, remembering the wiriness of Di. "She is very wonderful," said Jellyby. "Yes," I silently agreed, "most." "She is an angel," said her, I suppose naturally, partial sister, whose sentiments were besides, no doubt, at that moment colored by the surroundings in which she found herself. But I could not help being entertained by this example of lovable blindness. "It is so sweetly good of her to keep him off us," continued Frau von Ekthom. "She does it so kindly, so unselfishly. What can it be like to have such a husband?" Ah, thought I, a light illuminating my mind. They are talking of our friend John. Naturally his charming sister-in-law cannot bear him, nor should she be called upon to do so. To bear her husband is solely a wife's affair. "What can it be like?" repeated Frau von Ekthom in the voice of one vainly trying to realize something beyond words bad. "I can't think," said Jellyby basely, I thought, for he professed much outward friendship for John. "Of course she is amused in a way," continued Frau von Ekthom, "but that sort of amusement soon palls, doesn't it?" "Extraordinarily soon," said Jellyby. "Before it has so much as begun," thought I, recollecting the man's sallow, solemn visage. "But then it is no part of a wife's functions to be amused." "And she is really sorry for him," said Frau von Ekthom. Indeed, thought I, entertained by the patronizing attitude implied. "She says," continued her gentle sister, that his loneliness, whether he knows it or not, makes her ache. Well, I did not mind Mrs. Menzies-Leigh aching, so thought nothing definite there. She doesn't want him to notice we get out of his way. She's afraid he might be hurt. Do you think he would be? No, said Jellyby. Pure leather. I agreed, though once again surprised at Jellyby's baseness. I can't think, continued Frau von Ekthom. I suppose it's because I am so bad, but I really cannot think how she can endure him, and in such doses. He is undoubtedly, said Jellyby, a grievous bounder. What, I wondered, is a bounder? But I applauded Jellyby's sentiment nevertheless, for there was no mistaking its nature, though his baseness was really amazing. It must be because Di has such a vivid imagination, continued her sister musingly. She sees what he might have been, what he probably was meant to be. And what he would still be, put in Jellyby, if only he would allow his nice wife to influence him a little. But John, thought I, and that is right. Let us be fair and admit his good sides. A wife should never under any circumstances be allowed. Then suddenly, struck by the point of view of the feminine idea, socialists have the minds of women, of a man's being restored to what he was primarily intended to be when he issued newly made, as poets and parsons would say, from the hands of his maker through the manipulations of Mrs. Menzies-Leigh. My sense of humor played me a nasty trick, for I would have liked to have heard more, and I found myself bursting into a loud chuckle. "What's that?" exclaimed Jellyby, jumping up. He soon saw what it was, for I immediately put my head round the edge of the pillar. They both stared at me in a strange alarm. "Pray do not suppose," said I, smiling reassuringly, "that I am a ghost." They stared without a word. "You look as though I might be." They went on staring. I could not help, as I sat here, hearing what you were saying. They stared as speechless as though they had been caught killing somebody. "I really am not a spirit," said I, getting up. "Look, do I look like one?" And striking a match, I playfully passed it backward and forward across my features. But its light at the same time showed me a flush of the most attractive and vivid crimson on Frau von Ekthom's face, coloring it from her hair to her throat. She looked so beautiful like that, she who was ordinarily white, that immediately lighting another, I gazed at her in undisguised admiration. "Pardon me," I said, holding it very near her, while her eyes, fixed on mine, still seemed full of superstitious terror. "Pardon me, but I must, as a man and a judge, look at you." Jellyby, however, unforgivably ill-bred as ever, knocked the match out of my hand and stamped on it. "Look here, Baron," he said with unusual heat. "I am very sorry, as sorry as you like, but you really mustn't hold matches in front of somebody's face." "Why sorry, Jellyby?" I inquired mildly, for I was not going to have a scene. "I do not mind about the match. I have more." "Sorry, of course, that you should have heard every word, Jellyby," said I. "I tell you I'm frightfully sorry. I can't tell you how sorry." "You may be assured," said I, "that I will be discreet." He stared with a face of stupid surprise. "Discreet?" said he. "Discreet, Jellyby, and it may be a relief to you to know," I continued, "that I heartily endorse your opinion." Jellyby's mouth dropped open, every word of it. Jellyby's mouth remained open. Even the word bounder, which I did not understand, but which I gathered from your previous remarks is a very suitable expression. Jellyby's mouth remained open. I waited a moment, then seeing that it would not shut, and that I had really apparently shattered their nerves beyond readjustment by so suddenly popping round on them in that ghostly place, I thought it best to change the subject, promising myself to return to it another time. So I picked up my hat and stick from the chair I had vacated. Jellyby peered round the pillar at this piece of furniture with his unshut mouth, still denoting unaccountable shock, bowed and offered my arm to Frau von Arnim. "It is late," said I with tender courtliness, "and I observe an official approaching us with keys. If we do not return to the camp, we shall have your sister setting out, probably on angelic wings," she started, "in search of you. Let me, dear lady, conduct you back to her." "Nay, nay, you need have no fears. I really can keep a secret." With her eyes fixed on mine and that strange look of perfect fright in them, she got up slowly and put her hand on my proffered arm. I led her away with careful tenderness. Jellyby, I believe, followed in the distance. End of chapter 19.
Chapter 20 of The Caravaners by Elizabeth von Arnim. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 20. Life is a strange thing and full of surprises. The day before you think you know what will happen on the morrow, and on the morrow you find you did not. Light as you may the candle of your common sense, and peer as you may by its shining into the future, if you see anything at all, it turns out to have been, after all, something else. We are surrounded by tricks, by illusions, by fluidities. Even when the natural world behaves pretty much as experience has led us to expect, the unnatural world, by which I mean, and I say it is a fair description, human beings, does nothing of the sort. My ripe conclusion, carefully weighed and unattackably mellow, is that all one's study, all one's thought, all one's experience, all one's philosophy lead to this: that you cannot account for anything. Do you, my friends, interrupt me here with a query? My answer to it is, wait. The morning after the occurrences just described, I overslept myself, and on emerging about 10 o'clock in search of what I hoped would still be breakfast, I found the table tidily set out, the stove alight and keeping coffee warm, ham in slices on a dish, 3 eggs waiting to be transferred to an expectant saucepan, and not a single caravaner in sight except Menzies Leigh. Him, of course, I now pitied, for to have a treacherous friend and a sister-in-law of whom you are fond, but who in her heart cannot endure you, to be under the delusion that the one is sincere and the other loving, is to become a fit object for pity. And since no one can at the same time both pity and hate, I was not nearly so much annoyed as I otherwise would have been at finding my glum-faced friend was to keep me company. Annoyed, did I say? Why, I was not annoyed at all. For though I might pity, I was also secretly amused, and further the feeling that I now had a little private understanding with Frau von Arnim exhilarated me into more than my usual share of good humor. He was sitting smoking, and when I appeared, fresh and rested and cheery, round the corner of the Elsa, he not only immediately said good morning, but added an inquiry as to whether I did not think it a beautiful day. Then he got up, went across to the stove, put the eggs in the saucepan, and fetched the coffee-pot. This was very surprising. I tell you, my friends, the moods of persons who caravan are as many and as incalculable as the grains of sand on the seashore. If you doubt it, go and do it. But you cannot reasonably doubt it after listening to the narrative. Have I not told you in the course of it how the party spirits were up in the skies 1 hour and down on the ground the next? How their gaiety some days at breakfast was childish in its folly, and their silence on others depressing? How they quoted poetry and played at blind man's buff in the morning, and in the afternoon dragged their feet without speaking through the mud? How they talked far too much sometimes, and then, when I wished to, would not talk at all? How they were suddenly polite and attentive, and then as suddenly forgot I could possibly want anything? How the wet did not damp their hilarity one day, and no amount of sunshine coax it forth the next? But of all their moods, this of Menzies Lays in the field above Canterbury was the one that surprised me most. You see, he was naturally so very glum. True, at the beginning there had been gleams of light, but they soon became extinguished. True, also, at Frog's Hole Farm, when demonstrating truths by means of tea in glasses, he had been for a short while pleasant, only, however, to plunge immediately and all the deeper into gloom and ill temper. Gloom and ill temper was his normal state, and to see him attending to my wants, doing it with unmistakable assiduity, actively courteous, was astonishing. I was astonished, but my breeding enabled me to behave as though it were the most ordinary thing in the world, and I accepted sugar from him, and allowed him to cut my bread with the blank expression on my face of him who sees nothing unusual or interesting anywhere, which is, I take it, the expression of the perfect gentleman. When at length my plate was surrounded by specimens of all the comforts available, and I had begun to eat, he sat down again, and leaning his elbow on the table, and fixing his eyes on the city already sweltering in heat and vapor below, resumed his pipe. A train puffed out of the station along the line at the bottom of our field, jerking up slow masses of white steam into the hot, motionless air. "There goes Jellyby's train," said Menzies Leigh. "Jellyby's what?" said I, cracking an egg. "Train," said he. "Why, what has he got to do with trains?" I asked, supposing with the vagueness of want of interest that Jellyby, as well as being a socialist, was a railway director, and kept a particular train as another person would keep a pet. "He's in it," said Menzies Leigh. I looked up from my egg at Menzies Leigh's profile. "What?" said I. "In it," said he. "Obliged to go." "What? Jellyby gone? First Lord Sidge and now Jellyby?" Naturally I was surprised, for I had heard and noticed nothing of this. Also, the way one after the other left without saying good-bye seemed to me inconsiderate. At least that, probably more. "Yes," said Menzies Leigh, we are very sorry." I could not, however, honestly join in any sorrow over Jellyby, so merely remarked that the party was shrinking. "Yes," said Menzies Leigh, "that's rather our feeling too." "But why has Jellyby—" "Oh, well, you know, public man, Parliament, and all that." "Does your Parliament reassemble so shortly?" "Oh, well, soon enough. You have to prepare, you know. Collect your wits and that sort of thing." "Ah, yes, Jellyby should not leave that to the last minute. But he might," I added with a slight frown, "have taken leave of me according to the customs of good society. Manners are manners after all is said and done." "He was in a great hurry," said Menzies Leigh. There was a silence during which Menzies Leigh smoked and I breakfasted. Once or twice he cleared his throat, as though about to say something, but when I looked up prepared to listen, he continued his pipe and his staring at the city in the sun below. "Where are the ladies?" I inquired, when the first edge of my appetite had been blunted, and I had leisure to look about me. Menzies shifted his legs, which had been crossed. "They went to the station with Jellyby to see the last of him," said he. "Indeed, all of them?" "I believe so." Jellyby then, though he could not have the courtesy to say good-bye to me, could take a prolonged farewell of my wife and of the other members of our party. "He is not what we in our country would call a gentleman," I said, after a silence during which I finished the third egg and regretted there were no more. "Who is not?" asked Menzies. "Jellyby. No doubt the term bounder would apply to him quite as well as to other people." Menzies turned his sallow visage to me. "He's a great friend of mine," he said, the familiar scowl weighing down his eyebrows. I could not help smiling and shaking my head at that, all I had heard the night before so very fresh in my memory. "Ah, my dear sir," I said, "be careful how you trust your great friends. Do not give way too lavishly to confidence. Belief in them is all very well, but it should not go beyond the limits of reason." "He's a great friend of mine," repeated Menzies, raising his voice. "I wish, then," said I, "you would tell me what a bounder is." He glowered at me a moment from beneath black brows. Then he said more quietly, "I'm not a slang dictionary. Suppose we talk seriously." "Certainly," said I, reaching out for the jam. He cleared his throat. "I got a lot of letters and telegrams last night," he said. "How did you manage that?" I asked. "They were waiting for me at the post office here. I had telegraphed for them to be forwarded, and I'm sorry, but it's inevitable. We shall have to be off." "Off what?" said I, for a few of the more intimate English idioms still remained for me to master. "Off," said he. "Go, leave this." "Oh," said I, "well, we are used to that. This tour, my dear sir, is surely the very essence of what you call being off. Where do we go next? I trust to a place with trees in it." "You don't understand, Baron. We don't go anywhere next as far as the caravans are concerned. My wife and I are obliged to go home." I was, of course, surprised. "We are indeed," said I after a moment, "shrinking rapidly." Then the thought of being rid of Mrs. Menzies and her John and Jellyby at, so to speak, one swoop, and continuing the tour purged of those baser elements, with the tender lady entirely in our charge, made me unable to repress a smile of satisfaction. Menzies looked in his turn surprised. "I am glad," he said, "that you don't mind." "My dear sir," I said courteously, "of course I mind, and we shall miss you and your It was difficult on the spur of the moment to find an adjective, but Frau von Echtham's praises of her sister the night before coming into my mind, I popped in the word suggested angelic wife. He stared, ungratefully, I thought, considering the effort it had been. "But," I continued, "you may be very sure we shall take every care of your sister-in-law and return her safe and well into your hands on September the 1st, which is the date my contract with the owner of the Elsa expires." "I'm afraid," said he, "I wasn't clear. We all go, Betty included, and Jumps and Jane too." "I'm very sorry," he interrupted as I opened my mouth, "very sorry indeed that things should have turned out so unexpectedly, but it is absolutely impossible for us to go on. Out of the question." And he set his jaws and shut his mouth into a mere line of opposition and finality. Well, my friends, what do you say to that? What do you think of this example of the surprises life has in store for one? And incidentally, what do you think of human nature, especially of human nature when it caravans? And still more especially of human nature that is also English? Not without reason do our neighbors label the accursed island Perfide Albion. It is true I am not clear about the Albion, but I am very clear about the Perfide. Do you mean to tell me, I said, leaning toward him across the table and forcing him to meet my gaze, that your sister-in-law wishes to go with you? She does, said he. Then, sir, I began, amazement and indignation struggling together within me. I tell you, Baron, he interrupted, we are very sorry things have turned out like this. My wife is most genuinely distressed, but she too sees the impossibility. Unforeseen complications demand we should go home. Sir, I again began. My dear Baron, he again interrupted, it needn't in the least interfere with you. Old James will stay with you if you and the Baroness would like to go on. Sir, I have paid for a month and have only had a week. Well, go on and finish your month. Nobody is preventing you. But I was persuaded to join the tour on the understanding that it was a party, that we were all to be together, 4 weeks together. My dear fellow, said he, never had I been addressed as that before. You talk as if it were a business arrangement, a buying and selling, as if we were bound by a contract, under agreement. Your sister-in-law inveigled me into it, I exclaimed, emphasizing what I said by regular beats on the table with my forefinger, on the definite understanding that it was to be a party, and she was to be a member of it. Pooh, my dear Baron, Betty's definite understandings. She's in love, and when a woman's that, it's no earthly use. What? Said I, startled for a moment out of all self-possession. Well, he said, looking at me in surprise, why not? She's young, or do you consider it improper for widows? Improper? Natural, sir, natural. How long? Oh, before the tour even started. And propinquity, seeing each other every day. Well, he finished suddenly, one mustn't talk about it, you know. But you, my friends, what do you say to that? What do you think of this second example of the surprises life has in store for us? I have been in 2 minds as to whether I would tell you this one at all, but to a law-abiding man, calm and objective as I know myself to be, and as you by now must know me too, such an incident, though pleasurable, could not in any way affect or alter my conduct. Strictly Menzies lay was to be censured for mentioning it. However, that, I suppose, was what Jellaby called the bounder coming out in him, and I perceived that whatever they exactly may be, bounders have their uses. I repeat, I make no attempt to deny that it was a pleasurable incident, and although I am aware Storkwerder never liked her, chiefly, I firmly believe, because she would not ask it to her dinners, I am convinced that not one of you, my friends, and I say it straight in your faces, but would have been glad to stand at that moment in my shoes. I did not forget I was a husband, but you can be a husband and yet remain a man. I think I behaved very creditably. Only for an instant was there the least little lapse from complete self-possession. Immediately I became and remained perfectly calm. Edelgard, duty, my position in life, my beliefs, I remembered them all. It also occurred to me, but I could not well tell Menzies lay, that having regard to the behavior throughout the tour of his wife, it was evident these things ran in families. I could not tell him, but I felt myself inwardly in every way tickled. All I could do, indeed all I did do, was to say, "Strange, strange world," and get up from my chair because I found myself unable to continue sitting in it. "But what do you propose to do?" Menzies lay asked, after he had watched me taking a hasty turn or two up and down in the sun. "Behave," said I, stopping in front of him, "as an officer and a gentleman." He stared. Then he got up and said, with a touch of impatience, a most unreliable person as regards temper. Yes, yes, no doubt. But what shall I tell old James about your caravan? Are you going on or not? If not, he'll pilot it home for you. I'm afraid I must know soon. I haven't much time. I must get away today. What? Today? I must. I'm very sorry. Obliged to, you know. And the Ailsa? Oh, that's all arranged. I telegraphed last night for one of the grooms. He'll be down in an hour or two and take charge of it back to Panthers. And the Ilsa? He'll take that too. No, my dear sir, said I firmly. You leave the Ilsa in our charge, it and its contents. Eh? Said he. It and its contents, human and otherwise. Nonsense, Baron. What on earth would you do with Jane and Jumps? They're going up to town with me by train, and my wife and Betty. Oh, yes, by the way, my wife gave me instructions to tell you how very sorry she was not to be able to say good-bye to you. I assure you she was really greatly distressed, but she and Betty are motoring up to London and felt they ought to start as early as possible. But motoring? You said they had gone to the States. So they did. They saw Jellyby off, and then were picked up by a motor I ordered for them last night in the town, and went straight from there. I heard no more. He went on speaking, but I heard no more. The series of surprises had done their work, and I could attend to nothing further. I believe he continued to express regret and offer advice, but what he said fell on my ear with the indifferent trickling of water when one is not thirsty. At first anger, keen resentment, and disappointment surged within me, for why, I asked myself, did she not say good-bye? I walked up and down on the hot stubble, my hands deep in my pockets, and myself deep in conflicting emotions, while Menzies lay, supposing I was listening, regretted and advised, asking myself why she did not say good-bye. Then, gradually, I could not but see that here was tact, here was delicacy, the right feeling of the truly feminine woman, and began to admire her all the more because she had not said it. By degrees, composure stole upon me, reason returned to my assistance. I could think, arrange, decide, and before Edelgard came back with the 2 children, mere heated debris of that which had lately been so complete, what I had decided with the clear-headed rapidity of the practical and sensible man, was to give up the Elsa, lose my money, and go home. Home, after all, is the best place when life begins to wobble, and home in this case was very near the Ektham property. I only had to borrow a vehicle, or even in extremity take a droshka, and there I was. There, too, the delightful lady must sooner or later be, and I would at least see her from time to time, whereas in England, among her English relations, she was entirely and hopelessly cut off. Thus it was, my friends, that I did not see Frau von Ektham again. Thus it was our caravanning came to an untimely end. You can figure to yourselves what kind of reflections a man inclined to philosophize would reflect, as the reduced party hastily packed, in the heat and glare of the summer morning, that which they had unpacked a week previously, amid howling winds and hail showers, in the yard at Panthers. Nature then had frowned but vainly on our merriment. Nature now was smiling equally vainly on our fragments. One brief week, and what had happened? Rather, I should say, what had not happened? On the stubble I walked up and down, lost in reflection, while Edelgard, helped, officiously I thought, but I did not care enough to mind, by Menzies lay, stuffed our belongings into bags. She had asked no questions. If she had, I would not have answered them, being little in the mood, as you can imagine, to put up with wives. I just told her, on her return from seeing Jellyby off, of my decision to cross by that night's boat, and bade her get our things together. She said nothing, but at once began to pack. She did not even inquire why we were not going to look at London first, as we had originally planned. London? Who cared for London? My mood was not one in which a man bothers about London. With reference to that city, it can best be described by the single monosyllable cha. I will not linger over the packing or relate how, when it was finished, Edelgard indulged in a prolonged farewell, with embraces, if you please, of the two uninteresting fledglings, in a fervent shaking of both Menzies-Leigh's hands, combined with an invitation, I heard it, to stay with us at Storkwerder, and the pressing upon old James in a remote corner of something that looked suspiciously like a portion of her dress allowance, or how she then set out by my side for the station, steeped in that which we call Abschiedsstimmung, old James preceding us with our luggage, while the others took care for the last time of the camp, or with what abandonment of apparent affectionate regret she hung herself out of the train window as we presently passed along the bottom of the field and waved her handkerchief. Such rankness of sentiment could only make me shrug my shoulders, filled as I was by my own absorbing thoughts. I did glance up, though, and there on the stubble, surrounded by every sort of litter, stood the three familiar brown vehicles blistering in the sun, with Menzies-Leigh and the fledglings knee-deep in straw and saucepans and bags and other forlorn discomforts, watching us depart. Strange how alien the whole thing seemed, how little connection it seemed to have with me now that the sparkling bubbles, if I may refer to Frau von Eckham as bubbles, had disappeared and only the dregs were left. I could not help feeling glad as I raised my hat in courteous acknowledgment of the frantic wavings of the fledglings that I was finally out of all the mess. Menzies-Leigh gravely returned my salute. Our train rounded a curve, and camp and Caravaners disappeared at once and forever into the unrecallable past. End of Chapter 20.
Chapter 21 of The Caravaners. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Christine Rottger. The Caravaners by Elizabeth von Arnim. Chapter 21. Thus our caravanning came to an end. I could hardly believe it when I thought how at that hour of the day before I was lying beneath the hop poles of Frog's Hole Farm, with the greater part, as I supposed, of the tour before me. I could hardly believe that here we were again, Edelgard and I, tete-a-tete in a railway carriage, and with a future of, if I may coin a word, tete-a-teteness stretching uninterruptedly ahead as far as imagination could be induced to look. And not only just ordinary tete-a-teteness, but with the complication of one of the tetes, so to speak, being rankly rebellious and unwifely. How long would it take, I wondered, glancing at her as she sat in the corner opposite me, to bring her back to the reason in which she used before we came to England to take delight? I glanced at her and found she was looking at me, and immediately on catching my eye she leaned forward and said, "Otto, what was it you did?" They were the first words she had spoken to me that day, and very naturally, failing to see any point in them, I requested her not to be subtle, which is courteous for senseless. "Why," said she, not heeding this warning, "did the party break up? What was it you did?" Were there ever such questions? But I recollected she could not dream how things really were, and therefore was not as much put out as I would otherwise have been at the characteristically wifely fashion of at once, when anything seemed to be going wrong, attributing it to her husband. I therefore good-humouredly applied the Aunt Blockkugel remedy to her, and was willing to leave it at that if she had let me. She, however, preferred to quarrel. Without the least attempt to change the Blockkugel face, she said, "My dear Otto, poor Aunt Blockkugel, won't we leave her in peace? But tell me what it was you did." Then I became vexed, for really the assumption of superiority, of the right to criticize and blame, went further than a reasonable man can permit. What I said as we journeyed up to London I will not here repeat. It has been said before, and will be said often enough again, so long as husbands have had to have wives. But how about the responsibility resting on the wives? I remembered the cheerful mood I had been in on getting up, and felt no small degree of resentment at the manner in which my wife was trying to wipe it out. Give me a chance, and I am the kindest of men. Take away my chance, and what can I do? And so, my friends, as it were with a wrangle ended our sojourn on British soil. I lay down my pen, and become lost in many reflections as I think of all these things. Long ago have we settled down again to our ordinary Storchwarder life, and an Emilie instead of a Clotilde in the kitchen. Long ago we paid our calls, announcing to our large circle that we were back. We have taken up the threads of duty. We have resumed regulated existence, and gradually, as the weeks melt into months, and the influence of Storchwarder presses more heavily upon her, I have observed that my wife shows an increasing tendency once more to find her level. I need not have worried, I need not have wondered how I could bring her to reason. Storchwarder is doing it. Its atmosphere and associations are very potent. They are being, I am thankful to say, too strong for Edelgard. After a few preliminary convulsions, she began to cook my meals and look after my welfare as dutifully as before, and other effects will no doubt follow. At present she is more silent than before the tour, and does not laugh as readily as she used when I chanced to be in a jesting mood. Also at times a British microbe that has escaped the vigilance of those beneficent little creatures science tells us are in our blood, on the alert to devour intrusive foreigners, crops up and causes her to comment on my sayings and doings, rather a la Mrs. Menzies. But I frown her down or apply the Aunt Blockkugel, and in another few months I trust all will be exactly as it used to be. I myself am exactly as I used to be, a plain, outspoken, patriotic Christian gentleman, going steadily along the path of duty, neither looking to the right nor to the left. If I did, I should not see Frau von Ektham, for she is still in England, and using my humble abilities to do what I can for the glory of my country and my emperor. And now, having finished the narrative, there's nothing more to do but to buy a red pencil and put marks on it. Many, I fear, will be those marks. Unfortunate is the fact that you cannot be sincere without at the same time being indiscreet. But I trust what remains will be treated by my hearers with the indulgence due to a man who has only been desirous of telling the whole truth, or in other words, and which amount, I take it, to precisely the same thing, of concealing nothing. Postscriptum. A terrible thing has happened. Finished a week ago, and the invitations to come and listen are ready in the post, with the flat being cleaned in preparation, and beer and sandwiches almost, as it were, on the threshold. I have been obliged to take my manuscript once more out of the locked drawer which conceals it from Edelgard's eyes, in order to record a most lamentable occurrence. My wife received a letter this morning from Mrs. Menzies Leigh, informing her that Frau von Ektham is about to be married to Jellyby. No words can express the shock this has given me. No words can express my horror at such a union. Left to herself, helpless in the clutches of her English relatives, the gentle creature's very virtues, her pliability, her tender womanliness, had become the means of bringing about the catastrophe. She was influenced, persuaded, a prey. It is 6 months since she was handed over entirely to the Menzies Leighs. 6 months of no doubt steady resistance, ending probably in her health breaking down and in her giving in. It hardly bears thinking of. A Briton, a socialist, a man in flannel, no family, no money, and the most terrible opinions. My shock and horror are so great, so profound, that I have cancelled the invitations and will lock this up perhaps forever, certainly for some weeks. For how could I possibly read aloud the story of our harmonious and delightful intercourse with the tragic sequel of public knowledge? And my wife, when she read the letter at breakfast, clapped her hands and cried, "Isn't it splendid? Oh, Otto, aren't you glad?" End of chapter 21. End of The Caravaners by Elizabeth von Arnim. Read by Christine Rottger, February 4th, 2024, Westford, Massachusetts.